Good afternoon. Sounds like you can hear me. I can hear myself. Welcome, everyone, to Vashon Center for the Arts, to the beautiful K. White Hall. My name's Erica Carlton, and I'm the development director here. And I'm here today to welcome you and to welcome everyone who's joining us via the live stream as well, from wherever they are. And I can't think of a better place to be on a rainy Sunday afternoon, so I hope you're all happy to be here. Today we're going to have Michael Tracy giving a talk on music history. Michael Tracy is an Islander, and he's going to talk about one of jazz's great partnerships, in this case between Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. And together they produced some of jazz's greatest hits. Michael will be joined by jazz pianist Dylan Hayes, bassist Stanley Ruvinov, and drummer Xavier Lecouturier. So with that, sit back and enjoy, and come on out. There they are.
Before we get started, could you just double check your cell phone that it's completely off? I know it's tempting to take videos of these live performances, but if you could just not do that tonight, it is going to be filmed and will be archived on VCA's website, so you can always go back and see this as it is tonight. Thanks. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our musicians. First, Dylan Hayes on the piano. Dylan is a top jazz musician based in Seattle and the San Francisco Bay Area. He is the leader of the Jim Knapp Orchestra, DX-Tet, and the Dylan Hayes Electric Band. Dylan's debut record, Songs for Rooms and People, was released on Blue Jazz Productions in March 2020. His debut record was named one of the top 10 jazz albums of 2020 by the Seattle Times. Next, Stanley Ruvinov on bass. He's a musician originally from Bellevue. He was born into a life of music, beginning his studies on cello at age 7. In his teen years, he found a love of the bass and began his contrabass studies and also discovered jazz. Stanley earned a bachelor's degree in jazz studies and performance from Michigan State University and is playing professionally around the greater Seattle area since age 15. He is currently working on his master's in music at Temple University in Philadelphia. And on drums, Xavier Lecouturier is an American drummer. He's an American drummer and composer with French and Mexican heritage, a recent graduate of Cornish College, and both Dylan and Xavier are alumni of Cornish College Arts of Music Department. Xavier has been performing with his own quintet, DX-Tet, and with his close musical cohort, Dylan Hayes, throughout his college years. As a composer, Xavier encompasses various influences and styles: classical music, Latin jazz, Mexican pop rock, and American pop. A unique musician who will bring something new to this tradition of jazz and modern music. So we're so glad to have Dylan Hayes' trio tonight. So welcome. This afternoon, we'll explore the lives of 20th century's great collaboration in music and great music jazz arrangers and composers, Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. As with my previous lectures on composers, we try to imagine the world that Duke and Billy lived in. And especially with jazz, it is the history of race relations in the United States that we have to realize, admit, and understand. It was a reign of terror. Both men were brave in their use of music to overcome prejudices against blacks, But for Strayhorn, there was no NAACP or civil rights group for gay men. And the attitudes and extreme laws against homosexuality in the 30s and the 40s meant that Strayhorn had to be very careful. But despite this, he lived openly in Harlem with his partner. As you know, June is Pride Month. So let's celebrate the lives of these two men, one who was openly gay composer and arranger, and the other a leading black musician who supported each other and were great collaborators and mentors of one another. So tonight, and this afternoon, I'm sort of giving you a timeline that we will be traveling through. We'll be traveling over the next 2 hours of roughly 3/4 of a century when jazz arises from various geographic areas throughout the United States. New Orleans, Memphis, Kansas City, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and of course, New York City. The part one, we're gonna try to understand the terror that blacks went through in the early 1900s and the rise of the KKK. Part two, despite this, in the 1920s, jazz is born from various locales, and it's also the beginning of Duke Ellington's rise to fame. Part three, from 1930 to 1950, is when Ellington and Strayhorn joined together as collaborators, and this is the big band era. Also, let's realize in this period from 1920 to 1940, you have the introduction of some amazing methods of media that will bring music to millions, primarily the radio, the phonograph, and then eventually television. And then part four, from 1950 to the end of Ellington's life, this is basically when the big band era has come to an end. It's the rise of rock and roll, R&B, folk, and then smaller jazz in trios and quartets. And probably the prime example of that is Miles Davis' record in 1959, Kinda Blue. And all of this in stereo recording. Excuse me, there we go. But before we can enjoy this great new idiom of jazz, we have to be very honest what this country was doing back in the early 1900s and into the 1920s. When Edward Kennedy Ellington was 16 years old, the film Birth of a Nation debuted in silent movie theaters throughout the United States. The movie was based on a theater piece performed in Atlanta in 1906, which incited a series of race riots. The play was named The Klansman. And in 1915, D.W. Griffith made an epic 3-hour film glorifying the KKK. In the next 10 years, the KKK reemerged, certainly helped by the quote our US president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, provided for the opening film credits. By 1919, with the return of black troops after World War I, as well as the 19th Amendment that gave women, both black and white, the right to vote, race became a very important political strategy for supremacists. And I quote here, and I want to read it out loud, because it's, when you see this film, if you've never seen it, it's hard to watch, but it does give you an insight into our history. And Woodrow Wilson gave this quote: "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at least there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect Southern country." The race riots of Atlanta in 1906 were not alone. Throughout 1919, 1920, and 1921, the rural blacks of the South were migrating to the north and to other cities in the South for factory, office, and domestic work. And in these cities, the integrated trolley transport became a nexus for racial violence. Mostly white men fomented with racial hatred from the yellow press and white supremacist politicians. In Chicago, riots began when a young black boy accidentally walked over the invisible line on Lake Michigan Beach to the whites-only section. The boy was killed, and ensuing rampaging white gangs invaded South Chicago black neighborhoods. A similar instance happened in 1920 in Washington, D.C. And of course, this year we have commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa 1921 massacre. However, that massacre and so many, many, many others have been unnamed and almost forgotten. But let's hope that our memory now is more refreshed. Despite the obstacles facing a black man in 1920, Ellington, who had not studied music at all, he actually had gotten an artist scholarship to a local college. But after hearing Stride pianist in DC, he saw an opportunity for a career. In his early 20s, Ellington quickly spotted talented musicians who some of them would play with him in his band for over 20 years. They called themselves the Washingtonians and played for clubs and private white parties. Blacks were allowed in Washington, D.C. white households only if they were employed. The early and mid-1920s were dominated by early jazz greats like Fats Waller, Jelly Roll Morton, and James Johnson. Jitterbug and Charleston were the popular rhythms and dances at the time. So let's pause here with the lecture and hear a bit of Fats Waller, who was a big influence and supporter of Ellington. So if we can raise the screen, and can we raise the screen and we can get then Dylan to start? There we go. Dylan, please talk a bit what we're going to be hearing. Jitterbug Waltz by Fats Waller.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. In case you didn't know, we have Xavier Lecouturier on drums joining us, as well as Stanley Ruvinov. The first song we'll be playing is titled Jitterbug Waltz by the great Fats Waller. I'll be playing Hank Jones' arrangement of it, which was originally arranged for solo piano. However, I rearranged it for trio. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all, thank you. So we can bring down the screen and we'll move on to the next slide. By the mid-1920s, Ellington moved the band to New York City under the management of Irving Mills, who landed him the gig at the Cotton Club, and who reaped more than 50% of Ellington's music copyrights, royalties from 1925 to 1939, including such great hits as Mood Indigo and Sophisticated Lady. Irving Mills had a feel for the current music trends, and Ellington heeded his advice. Also, what stood Ellington's band apart from the others is that they played without music scores in front of them. This gave, in itself, a spontaneity and directness with the audience which other bands did not have. The original Cotton Club opened in a small brownstone in Harlem in the 1920s during Prohibition and was closed by 1933, which coincidentally was the end of Prohibition. There, a bottle of champagne started at $1,000 in today's dollars, and this is the height of the Depression. It was a white-only audience, entertained by the best black musicians and dancers, owned by the mob that ensured flowing liquor at the bar. Musicians were well paid and respected. Soon, radio live broadcasts would bring the Cotton Club into American homes without racial barriers. A later reincarnation of the Cotton Club opened in the mid-1940s in the West 50s in Manhattan. And what you see here is that second reincarnation. In 1939, the original Cotton Club is closed, and Ellington goes on the road with his touring band. They perform in Pittsburgh, and later that night, Ellington is introduced to a precocious young pianist and composer, Billy Strayhorn. Strayhorn, a small, diminutive, black, gay man, soon became Ellington's closest collaborator. Strayhorn could play exactly what Ellington had played when they first met, and Ellington gave him a score to arrange. Now, arrangement is where you have a certain number of players in the band, maybe 2 sax, 2 trombones, 2 trumpets, bass player, pianist, etc. An arranger knows what those particular musicians can play best. And so it's not just an ability to write music, it's ability to understand what the individual musicians are capable of. And Strayhorn always said that in order for a piece to really work, it had to be easy for the musician to play. Though Ellington had not come from a background of musical training, Strayhorn did. He went to Westington House High School in Pittsburgh and had excellent musical training in counterpoint, in impressionism, in lieder. And so he was a great complement to Duke Ellington's gift of improv and showmanship. And Ellington was a performer. He spoke eloquently to his audiences far beyond what was expected of a black man, especially a musician. To entertain his audience, Ellington would flash his hands in the air while playing, just like Franz Liszt was supposedly doing back in the 1840s. So we're going to hear a bit from Ellington and Strayhorn. The second piece you'll hear is Strayhorn's Lush Life, a song he composed in his teens and finally allowed it to be recorded by Ellington in the 1940s. The lyrics are Strayhorn's, and for a teenager, they're quite sophisticated and mature. Lush Life has been recorded by everyone you can imagine. John Coltrane did a recording, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, even today's Lady Gaga. It's one of 20th century's great gifts to musical heritage. To give you an understanding, now we're not going to hear the lyrics because we just have the trio here, so I'm just going to quote the very first verse, and you get a sense of this sophisticated sensibility in this piece of music. I used to visit all the very gay places, those come what may places, where one relaxes on the axis of life to get the feel of life from jazz and cocktails. So if we can raise the screen, we're going to hear 3 pieces, and Love You Madly by Ellington, Lush Life by Strayhorn, and Fleurette Africaine, which was composed later in Ellington's career. So please, Dylan, it's all yours.
Okay, we'll be starting off actually with Love You Madly, just to make sure you know that. And then the next song we'll play is Lush Life.
Sorry.
Anyways, so this song, Love You Madly, was arranged by Duke Ellington, and I rearranged it for trio with piano, bass, and drums. However, it was originally arranged for guitar, piano, and bass. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Now it's on. Now we're going to play the song Lush Life by Billy Strayhorn, which, by the way, Billy Strayhorn was born in 1915, and he wrote this song sometime between 1933 and 35. So he was like 15 years old or so when he wrote this song. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so 2 more songs, and then he's going to get back to his lecture. So this first song is called African Flower by Duke Ellington, and it's off the Money Jungle record featuring Charles Mingus and Max Roach, which I highly suggest checking out if you haven't already. And that'll segue into Don't Get Around Much Anymore. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks.
If we could bring the screen down. Thank you all. That was great. So the next period we're walking into is the 1950s. And most of America has come back from World War II, starting up families. There's the whole exodus from the city to the suburbs. So the days of the big nightclubs, big bands, and big huge arenas was dwindling away fast. Despite this, Ellington band kept on touring. And when there were no gigs to play, Ellington kept his band members on salary. And it's one of the few reasons why his band, among all the others who were tremendous hits in the 1940s, still remained even into the 1960s. A new, fresh venue for jazz were the big outdoor festivals. And one of the most important ones that came about in the 1950s was the Newport Jazz Festival, which was, in a way, the last big hurrah for the big band. By 1950s, Ellington was already considered old school, not hip or part of the beat generation. Reluctantly, the Newport producer, George Wein, was pushed by Columbia Records to invite Ellington and his band. Completely unprepared to present a new kind of music, which Ellington's promoter at that time, Joey Glazer, said he had to do, Ellington, as before, went to Billy Strayhorn, who worked up on new works, new arrangements, but the success was primarily due to a 20-minute riff of Paul Gonsalves, a saxophone player, who by the end of his riff, the audience was leaping in their seats and screaming with joy. It was a huge success. Ellington's successful comeback at Newport was so evident that in August 20th, 1956, Ellington is on the front cover of Time magazine. Most of us who are in this audience do remember Time magazine as one of the major periodicals you would get every week. And often they would feature a prominent person or infamous person on their front cover. The article on Ellington talked about his career, his band members, but never once mentioned Billy Strayhorn. Ellington's manager and PR agent, Joey Glazer, who arranged the article, made sure that there was no mention of this talented composer who happened to be gay. Strayhorn was devastated and would soon split from Ellington for a number of years. During Ellington's career, he had two managers. The first, who booked him at the Cotton Club, Irving Mills, and then later in the 50s, Joey Glazer. In the PBS program of the history of jazz, there was quite a discussion about the exploitation of white producers, the white owning record companies, etc., who would often get 50% of the royalties. In today's world, a composer does not give up 50% of his royalties to his agent. But those were different times, and Ellington, though very smartly, kept track of his royalties and supported his band with them. Both Billy Strayhorn and Lena Horne come from Pittsburgh, but they first met when she was in Hollywood, and Ellington asked Billy to watch over her. Lena Horne had started as a chorus girl in the Cotton Club and then started a film career in Hollywood. Billy and Lena's friendship endured for over 2 decades, and they were extremely devoted to one another. While in Hollywood, Billy coached Lena on how to use her upper range and still keep her low notes. She had had no vocal training beforehand. I can only guess that Strayhorn picked up vocal coaching by rehearsing school plays and musicals at the Westinghouse High School. There were many great jazz artists who came from Pittsburgh and from Westinghouse High School, such as Roy Eldridge, Earl Hines, Billy Eckstein, Kenny Clark, and Mary Lou Williams, and Ahmad Jamal, and of course, Errol Garner. It was in the mid-1950s when Lena's husband, Lenny Hayton, asked Billy what was he earning in the way of royalties, especially over such great hits as Take the A Train. Strayhorn had no idea, and when he finally researched, it caused him to break off his relationship with Ellington for a number of years. In 1959, Otto Preminger, who was a sort of an avant-garde type of film director, brought together Jimmy Stewart and Duke Ellington in an American film noir classic called Anatomy of a Murder. I do suggest you see it. It's really extremely, extremely interesting of a film. It's a must-see. And Ellington involved Strayhorn to write the score for the film, and then Billy Strayhorn coached Jimmy Stewart, who I didn't know was an amateur pianist, but coached him on how to play with Ellington to get the beat, to get the voicing and the fingering. Strayhorn had done this with other musicians to coach them. He did this with Rosemary Clooney when she did a record with Ellington, and she also helped Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald needed no coaching and singing, but he helped her with the Duke Ellington arrangements. By the late 50s and early 60s, both Ellington and Strayhorn are recording independently with a trio or small band, not the big 20-piece bands as earlier done. Ellington's record with Charlie Mingus and Max Roach is a treasure, and you must listen to this to understand how quickly Ellington could change his style for the period. There's a bit of change in this slide. We've already heard Don't Get Around Anymore, and we've heard Fleuret Africain. So the next piece I believe we have is Things Ain't the Way They Used to Be.
The next piece I'll be playing is Lotus Blossom.
Oh, okay.
I'll be doing a medley between Lotus Blossom, Sophisticated Lady, and then Things Ain't the Way They Used to Be.
Okay.
So yeah, Lotus Blossom was written by Billy Strayhorn. Sophisticated Lady was written by Duke Ellington, and that can be dedicated to all the sophisticated ladies out there. We wouldn't be here without you, and yeah.
By the way, Lotus Blossom was Duke's absolutely favorite song of Billy Ellington, and there is an extremely touching recording of him doing it, but it's just a gorgeous song, so please.
Sure. And then following that would be Things Ain't the Way They Used to Be, which plays true to 2020 for obvious reasons, but here we go, thank you.
If we can bring the screen down, that'd be great. Thank you all. That was superb, superb. So while the screen is coming down, we'll move, we'll move on into the 1960s with Billie Hodges and Billy Strayhorn playing together on an album. Now, Billie Hodges had been playing with Duke Ellington for over 30 years, and his saxophone playing was one of the true trademarks of the Ellington sound. This album was the first and only moment the two musicians performed and recorded completely independent of Ellington. At the same time that they're writing, composing, and working on this album, jazz completely loses its young audience. They are now listening and buying records to rock and roll. And of course, the newest musical phenomena, the Beatles. Sales for jazz records plummet, and the idiom basically goes underground. That is to say, from the big venues, the big concert halls, to the small jazz clubs, the very intimate venues, the small cafes. Of course, the smaller audience meant less revenue and meant much smaller bands. Strayhorn never ventured into the performing career, most likely because he would not be booked, being an outwardly gay man in the 1950s and 60s. So, though he never compromised, unfortunately, he remained obscure and almost unknown for decades in the history of jazz music. So if you just bear with me for a moment, there we go. A valuable partnership is a notion of business management, and it takes place when the partners basically match each other's in their skills. And this was the case with Ellington and Strayhorn. They wrote songs together, they had similar styles. Strayhorn knew Debussy, Ravel, fugal writing, counterpoint. Ellington knew his band and could pick up a gig that a band member had just tossed off one day. If through touring and late nights, Ellington was kept from writing songs and completing orchestrations and projects, and he had many projects he was working on, such as musical on Broadway, Black, Beige, and Brown. He had also a big concert at Carnegie Hall that Strayhorn was very instrumental in helping him with. But by the late 1950s, after Strayhorn understands more about royalties, he and Ellington get back together and under a more equal and fair business arrangement. The life of drinking and smoking, unfortunately, catches up with Billy Strayhorn. I'm sorry. And he is diagnosed with cancer in 1965 and passes away in 1967. At his memorial in St. Paul's Lutheran Church, Ellington was emotionally unable to give the eulogy himself, so the preacher spoke for him. And I just give a small quote from that eulogy. By the way, Ellington could speak just beautifully. I mean, he had incredible vocabulary and nuance with the English language. And this is what he said about Strayhorn. He spoke English and French very well, but condensation did not enter into his mind. He demanded freedom of expression and lived in what we consider the most important of moral freedoms. Freedom from hate, unconditionally. Freedom from self-pity, even throughout all the pain and bad news. Freedom from fear of possibly doing something that might help another more than it might himself. And freedom from the kind of pride that could make a man feel he was better than his brother or neighbor. His oeuvre will never be less than the ultimate on the highest plateau of culture, end of quote. A year after Strayhorn's death, Ellington records an album just of Strayhorn's works. And for this album, they include some works that Billy Strayhorn actually had written from his hospital bed. That's called Blood Count, which features an amazing, amazing wail of sorrow by Johnny Hodges on sax. At the end of the album, the engineers left the mics on. Ellington spontaneously walks to the piano by himself. The rest of the band is in the background packing up their instruments. And you hear that in the background with this recording. But the engineers left the mics live, and Ellington sits down and plays Lotus Blossom. And it is probably one of the most touching eulogies a musician has ever given to another. Xavier and Dylan and Stanley, the stage is yours again, so please.
Thank you. This next song we'll be playing is titled Don't You Know I Care by Duke Ellington. It's off of my favorite record of Duke Ellington's, which is titled Cool Rock, which Michael was actually just playing in the lobby earlier on today. And this arrangement is inspired by Mulgrew Miller's arrangement, which is trio, as well as Johnny Hartman's. So, thank you. So it looks like we're down to the last song here, and I thought, what better way to end the set with the theme song to Duke Ellington's orchestra, which is titled "Take the A Train," and it's written by Billy Strayhorn. So yeah, here's my arrangement. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, thank you. We're going to bring them on for an encore, so that's not the last of it yet. But thanks. Oh, what a great piece that is. So it's the mid-1960s, and Ellington's career is trying to keep up pace, constant touring all around the world. He's a big smoker, and of course, eventually he will succumb to lung cancer, as did Billy Strayhorn. But in 1969, for 70th birthday of Duke Ellington, President Nixon invites him to the White House to receive the Medal of Freedom. I highly recommend that you watch this ceremony on YouTube. At one point, Nixon jokes about awarding the medal to Edward Kennedy Ellington. Obviously, Edward Kennedy being a nemesis to Nixon. And later that evening, you see mixed racial couples dancing to Ellington's music in the White House. A vast change from the days of Woodrow Wilson, when a black couldn't even enter the White House. As I said, within 4 years of this ceremony, Ellington succumbs to years of smoking. And that concludes my lecture for today. We can raise the screen now. To me, this relationship between Ellington and Strayhorn goes back and forth between musicians and musicologists, like who wrote what and who is really Ellington, who is really Strayhorn. And frankly, I don't think it really matters because the music stands on its own. Usually at this moment, we do Q&A, but it is getting late. But does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? And if you can, stand up and speak sort of loudly. We can't pass around a microphone, as you can imagine. Any questions? Okay, well, great. Then everything was explained in perfect order then. But as I promised, let's bring on Dylan and the band for an encore. I believe Dylan said they're going to play a piece called Upper Manhattan Medical Group. And it's true. This is the name of the piece. It was written by Billy Strayhorn as a dedication to his doctor, Albert Logan, and his wife Miriam. They were among the aristocracy of Black America, and they had a brownstone in Upper West Side, and he had a very successful medical practice. And it was Dr. Logan who realized that Strayhorn had something going on and had him diagnosed with cancer. And so from this period, Strayhorn writes this piece as a dedication to his medical group. It's a superb piece. Thank you. All yours.
Thank you all so much. It means the world to me that you came out today, and it's so amazing to play live music once again after this pandemic, although it's still kind of going on, pandemic. But thank you, Michael Tracy. Give it up for Michael Tracy. That was a beautiful lecture. Give it up for Xavier Lecouturier on drums, Stanley Ruvinov on the bass, and the entire crew here. I wish I remembered everybody's names. I know Michael Hayes is in the back, and that's actually, he has the same name as my dad, so that's kind of weird. But other than that, thank you to the social media person. Why am I forgetting? I forget her name, but thank you all. It means the world to me, and even though I can't really see you with the blinded lights, you guys are all amazing. Yeah.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you all for coming tonight, and good evening from VCA.